in fact, this is the case. Art.
I think it's really important to remember that when Timothy says all Scripture is inspired by God, he was not referring to the Bible that we have. That Bible was not put together yet. Those books had not been codified and voted on as the books that were part of Scripture. So he's talking about something different than a specific book which we have in our hands.
Absolutely. Great point. Atticus? Hang on a second. Hang on.
We also got to know that there's also the Apocrypha and the fact that everything that we have, the collection of the Bible, is not all of Scripture. It is what the Catholic Church decided would be Scripture for everyone.
Yeah, so Atticus brings up a great point, and I heard the question, Scripture means writings, right? Atticus brings up a great point about, and I think this is to my point about where I come to in terms of inspiration and authority. You know, it wasn't that the Bible was sort of piecemealed together by a couple people who sat down and just thought, you know, this would be a good idea. We probably need to do this, you know, for, you know, our tradition's sake or something. This was a very thoughtful process over a long period of time about what made it in the canon and what did not and why. There were very specific criteria like, did the person who write this, especially for the New Testament, did the person who write this, did they have a first-hand account, a first-hand witness of Jesus and his disciples, or his disciples? That was one of the criteria. Another criteria, is it consistent with sort of what we might call the tradition of the time or the common beliefs around Jesus and the time? Or is this kind of an outlier? Is this sort of really weird and out there? If it was not consistent, it was not included. There was a very thoughtful process about how the Bible was put together over time, and it didn't come together overnight, and it was complex, and it was intentional and faithful. And can we not believe that God was a part of that process in some way, shape, or form? You know, this is important in terms of the way that I think about how the Bible is put together. Can the Bible have expectations of us when we sit down and read it? Can the Bible have expectations of us when we sit down and read it? Or can God have expectations of us when we sit down and read the Bible? It's this, come on, you know what I meant. Yeah. Go ahead.
That we bring our intellect to it and our life experience.
Okay, that we bring our thought and reason and rationale to it, yes. Hold on, I'm going to go to the next one. Okay, yep. What else? What other expectations might God have of us when we come to Scripture?
I can only think of two scriptures that stick to my life, and that's Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, and Philippians 3:14, forgetting what lies behind, because both of those scriptures have inspired me at different times in my life and given me hope that I can walk forward. And that's where the inspiring comes from, is, you know, it doesn't always have to be lightning bolts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What other expectations might get that we bring our thought to it? What else? Our reason?
Knowledge of history?
Yeah, certainly.
Before you put the screen up, I was thinking of this first thing, prayerfully with the Spirit. You've got to be focused in God. A lot of times, for me, if I'm reading parts of the Bible or I'm thinking about something that's happening in my life and I pray about it, it all comes together. I'm led to a particular scripture and it gives me an answer. Yeah. But it's just more than just reading words. You really got to be tuned into the Almighty.
Yeah, I mean, all of us as people of faith are going to read Scripture hopefully with that spirit, imagining that spirit to be present, versus someone who's just sitting down to academically do a study on it, right? We all bring that component to us. I mean, this is the story of, I'm not going to say what everybody believes, but many believe that, at Pentecost, the Spirit comes down and is with us, among us, always, right? And so that Spirit is with us. We talked about tradition, reason, experience. To Linda's point, all those things we bring with us when we read. And then I think one of the key things, too, is that we read it in the way that we're talking, the way we're doing it right now. That we are in conversation with others. Reading Scripture in a vacuum, Scripture itself is a conversation among all of these people throughout time who are talking with one another about God. That's where we come from. That's who we are. And so reading Scripture without conversation partners makes it very challenging because we need those perspectives. We need those different ideas. And then I would say finally that, because I know we got to wrap up here, I think there's the sense Hamilton talks about, there's this kind of perspective out there, the Bible said it, that's it, it's done. The Bible is full of people evolving in their ideas about who and what God is and what practices we should have. The book of Galatians is an entire letter about whether or not the early Christians should continue to practice circumcision or not. And what happens? Do we practice circumcision today as Christians? For religious purposes? You don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian, right? This is the conversation that was taking place at that time, and they evolved in that and changed. The early Christians were still doing it, holding on to that Jewish practice, and then they stopped doing it. The same is true of the church, many churches. Do women have a different role today in the church than they used to in many churches? Do the Bible condones slavery? Do we think differently about slavery today than they did in ancient times? So the point is, we're always evolving in our thinking about God and our practices, right? This is not a new thing for us to imagine something differently in today's world. This has been ongoing throughout our history as people of faith. Casey.
Yeah, just to kind of put a little bit of my own recent experience, because I'm currently slowly reading the Old Testament, and I've made it to Numbers. But just kind of to that involvement, you start with the story in Genesis of Adam and Eve, and it's a very childlike understanding of the rules of the world. Don't eat the apple. We eat the apple. You further evolve into the Exodus story, which goes into eventual, leading the Israelites to the Mount Sinai, and then Moses goes up and gets the 10 Commandments. Those are now the rules. We went from one rule to now we got 10 rules, and then you go to Leviticus, and it's like you've got who knows how many rules, and and it keeps getting more complex as it goes on. Mm-hmm. And then, as I'm starting Numbers right now, it's very much about the people and the different relationships with the different tribes of the Israelites. And the one thing that I think is an interesting constant throughout them all is the people in the story and their understanding, and they're trying to figure out what this is really all about. And I think that that's kind of where we still are today. Yeah. Even today, we're just not writing books of the Bible about it, but we still certainly are writing a lot.
Oh yeah,
of the Bible.
Absolutely.
We're still trying to figure it out.
Absolutely.
We were figuring it out back then.
Is the world simpler today? The world getting easier and simpler? It's becoming more complex. Our brains were not as developed in the first century as they are today. So we thought about everything differently. Everything's becoming increasingly complex, and as we live into that complexity, obviously the way we think about everything changes to some degree, right? Okay, so this is the foundational piece. I'm sorry we didn't talk about sex today. I promise we're getting there. But we had to lay some foundation today because this then gets us into the conversations we're going to have over the next several weeks. We've got a couple minutes probably if you have any questions or want to make any comments before we exit for worship. Any questions anybody has? Dottie? Comment?
I was in a Christian College of Georgia Christian College of Georgia Bible class about 10 years ago, and we discussed at length, maybe one whole class period, what books would we put in a Bible today? Who would be the writers? You know, Billy Graham came up, Jerry Falwell came up, but what would that Bible look like today?
Interesting. Yeah. Atticus, one more comment, and then we'll all head out.
What would it take for this church to become open and affirming?
We're going to get there. That's week 6. That's the last week. Yep. That's the last week. The last week, I kind of gave a framework at the very beginning. The last week is going to be the criteria that we would need to, which we're already doing almost all of, but you're going to see what it would take, and we're going to have some conversation about what that would mean. So good question, Atticus.
A lot of sex next week.
Leslie says there's a lot of sex next week, so come back next week, Leslie's going to help lead the conversation next week, so look forward to having you. Thank you for being here.